Well, good afternoon, or evening, or morning, or whatever the case may be, to all out there. My name is Jason Wheeler, and I am one of the pastors at North Park Church in Columbus, Nebraska, and I'm coming to you with your life group application questions again for the week. And as always, I am very grateful to be doing that. And we are, as I'm sure you guys are aware, in our Kingdom series still, looking at the kingdom of God from the Gospel of Matthew. And we are at week 175 of that lesson, that message, that series. And today we are looking at Matthew chapter 23. I believe it might say 22 on your outline, but it's 23. Matthew chapter 23, verses 1 through 12. And we're looking at religion, external versus internal. And we've got Jesus running up against these Pharisees here again, who do all of their works to be seen by man, right? We're going to see that in our key verses. And I am going to go ahead and read those verses out loud right now. You've got them on your screen right there. I'm sure that you guys have your copy of God's Word open. I'm sure that you have a notebook in front of you to take some notes. You've got your outline there. You're ready to go. So here we go. I'm going to read these verses. You guys follow along, and we'll jump right into those discussion questions. Then Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, "The scribes and Pharisees sit on Moses' seat. So do and observe whatever they tell you, but not the works they do. For they preach, but do not practice. They tie up heavy burdens, hard to bear, and lay them on people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to move them with their finger. They do all their deeds to be seen by others. For they make their phylacteries broad and their fringes long, and they love the place of honor at feasts, and the best seats in the synagogues, and greetings in the marketplaces, and being called rabbi by others. But you are not to be called rabbi, for you have one teacher, and you are all brothers. And call no man your father on earth, for you have one Father who is in heaven. Neither be called instructors, for you have one instructor, the Christ. The greatest among you shall be your servant. Whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted." Okay, so some powerful stuff there. You know, Jesus is very concerned, obviously, at the influence of these religious leaders, their example, and he sees that the disciples and the crowds are observing the way they behave. So again, he's going to speak into that very powerfully. And remember that we talked about, or Pastor Lynn rather, talked about the difference between external and internal religion. And again, we see that these Pharisees, as it says here, they do all their works to be seen by others. They are not willing to actually obey. They're not renouncing anything. They look the part, their phylacteries and their robes look impressive. And they know the scriptures, and they recite them accurately, but they do not practice what they preach. All external. And remember that we learned that external religion makes religious appearances, looks religious, looks the part. External religion takes prestigious positions and insists on distinguished titles. And we see that in our key verses, don't we? They want to take the place of honor at feast and the best seats in the synagogues. They love to greet people and be called rabbi. It's all external. But then we also had three countermeasures from our message on Sunday to counter external religion, to counter doing all of your righteous deeds to be seen by others. So we as believers need to remember that disciples are all brothers, that God is to be glorified, not man, and Christ is our teacher. Okay, so there's our recap of the message. Let's go ahead and jump into our questions then. Okay, so for question 1, so we're talking about external versus internal, and we know that the outside is not nearly as important as the inside. But for a moment, let's think about how and when the outside is important. You know, one of the mistakes that I know we as Christians can make is to go too far in the other direction and think that external appearances, what's on the outside, means absolutely nothing. Some people would go so far as to make their goal to not care at all, to almost revere that which is irreverent when it comes to like external appearance or external example. So we know the outside's not nearly as important as the inside, but when and how is the outside important? And are you mindful of this in your life? Pray about that and talk about that now. Okay, moving on to question 2. You know, we see that Jesus says in verse 12, whoever exalts himself will be humbled. If you try to lift yourself up and make yourself something, you're going to be brought low. And whoever humbles himself will be exalted. If you stay low, then in due time, God will uphold you with his mighty right hand, right? So, that being said, and we see all through these verses, not just these verses, but Jesus' entire interaction with these Pharisees, with the Sadducees, with the religious leaders, that they are absolutely determined to exalt themselves. But what might that look like for us? That's question 2. What does it look like in general to exalt yourself? What's going on in your heart when you're exalting yourself? Because sometimes externally, the humble person and the proud person can look very, very similar. Not always, but sometimes. So what does it look like, maybe physically, to exalt yourself, but also what's going on in your heart when you're exalting yourself? And then when are you most tempted to do this, to exalt yourself? What circumstance, what situation are you most tempted to do this with? And then maybe think of a specific situation where you have recently done this, or maybe were tempted to. Pray about that and talk about that now. Okay, moving on to question 3. It is interesting, as Pastor Lynn pointed out, that in verse 3 here, Jesus says, in instructing the people, he says of these Pharisees, do and observe what they tell you, but not the works they do, for they preach, but do not practice. So a couple of things there. Of course, Jesus does not want to encourage people to be rebellious and disobedient. People don't need help with that at all. We can quickly descend into chaos with that heart. But also what we see is that these Pharisees oftentimes were giving the right instruction, but they weren't practicing it. They were hypocrites. They weren't adhering to it themselves. So for question 3, when do you struggle with that? In what way do you struggle with practicing what you preach? When is that toughest for you? Pray about that and talk about that now. Okay, moving on to question 4. We see that, I think it's in verse 5 here. Jesus says, they do all their deeds, speaking of the Pharisees, to be seen by others, for they make their phylacteries broad and their fringes long. So they've got these phylacteries, these prayer boxes that they have wrapped around themselves. And the heart behind that, a good thing, to keep those prayers close to you, to be mindful of that. But they don't have those phylacteries in order to have a right heart or to remember to pray. They want to look impressive. And it's the same with the robes that they wear. They want to look impressive. They're putting things on that on many levels have the appearance of godliness, and in some circumstances might even be godly, but their heart in it is just to be impressive, to make people see them a certain way. So for question 4, I'm sure if you're watching this that you're probably not wearing big religious robes and you probably don't have phylacteries, but what is your equivalent? What are your robes and phylacteries? What are the things that maybe you adorn yourself in order to look the part? And then what position and or title are you shooting for? Now, there's nothing wrong with seeking a position in ministry, seeking to grow in the Lord to the point where you're serving Him in maybe even some official capacity, right? As long as your motivation, your heart is right, you're prayerful about it, you're called to it. So what position and or title are you shooting for? Maybe it's for the right reasons, maybe it's for the wrong reasons. And then what in your life do you struggle with renouncing? So, you've got three parts there. What are your robes and phylacteries? What position and or title are you shooting for? And what in your life do you struggle with renouncing? We see that these religious leaders, they wouldn't renounce anything. We know that we are called to renounce all in order to follow Christ, but there are things that He calls us to renounce that are tough to put down. What might those things be for you? So that's it. Question 4 in 3 parts. Pray about that. Talk about that now. Okay, and moving on to question 5, we talked about those countermeasures to doing all of our works to be seen by others, which is something that we're all tempted to do, that we all struggle with on some level. But those countermeasures were knowing that disciples are all brothers, God is to be glorified, and Christ is our teacher. So prayerfully, maybe looking at your notes from the message on Sunday, thinking back to that message. For question 5, of those 3 countermeasures to doing all of your righteous deeds to be seen by others, which stood out to you most and why? Go ahead and talk about that now. Okay, and 6th and final question. The big question is this: is your aim to please God or man? As Pastor Lynn told us, it is impossible to be saved when you are doing your deeds to be seen by others. Now again, not that that's not a struggle, what people think, what you want them to think, but ultimately, underneath all of it, our aim needs to be to please God. It needs to be His glory. It needs to be trusting Him, regardless of people, regardless of circumstances. So considering everything that we've talked about here today, considering everything that you learned from the message, do you think your aim is truly to please God, or is it to please man? And what's the evidence of your answer one way or the other? How do you know? And then what is your next step? If you want to talk about multiple steps, next steps, that's fine. But what I'd like you to do right now is just really prayerfully consider the one next step that God would have you take in aiming to please Him more than others, in developing a deeper internal religion and laying aside all of the external stuff. Just one next step. So that's it for this week, guys. As always, it's been a pleasure. You know how to get a hold of me if you need me, www.insidenp.com, or get the app Inside NP. Just look for the compass. Don't forget to check out the content that comes out every week. Pastor Ryan puts out a midweek message every Wednesday. A very powerful, great, helpful, insightful message that you guys should all be checking out. Jonathan Kaufman puts out the youth lesson on Sunday mornings. That is great stuff. Definitely check that out. And as always, be praying. Be praying. So wonderful to be a part of such a great church. And Lord willing, I will be back with you next week.